Well, thank you all for being here. I'm glad to hear we have a little more time to discuss, but I understand that with lunch coming next, I don't want to take up too much of your time. So what we're looking at in the 2014 midterm elections that are coming up during the first week of November in the United States are actually extremely significant. We think about presidential elections as being the big elections, the one that everyone pays attention to. But actually, in these midterm elections, pretty much every member of the United States House of Representatives, a significant number of our nation's governors, and 1/3 of the U.S. Senate is up for re-election. Effectively, the only difference is there is no presidential candidate on the ballot. But there are enormous consequences when you have that number of people, all of whom are up for re-election. So while the president is just went to my next slide and it has gone away.
Oh, there we go.
Okay, there we go. Wonderful. So though the president is not on the ballot, his job approval matters. How Americans feel about the president, even though they are not going to the ballot box to check his name or check the name for an opponent, it influences how they vote in a number of ways. First, for folks who are Democrats, who are loyal to the president, if they are somewhat disappointed in how he has done, they may be less likely to show up in these midterm elections. And Republicans seem to have a slight advantage in these midterms, precisely for many of the reasons that Sasha mentioned earlier, that these Republican voters tend to be sort of more regular, easy to count on to turn out even in elections like a midterm. So with the president's job approval now in negative territory, he's at 50% disapproval in the most recent CBS New York Times poll. That's not a great place to be. It means that a lot of folks, again, who would otherwise be maybe enthusiastic about turning out on the Democratic side might feel less excited to do so. And for those voters who are persuadable, they're less likely to want to go vote to send President Obama a more favorable Congress in Washington to work with if they're not enthusiastic about the policies he has in place. Interestingly, though many of the last few elections have been very sort of economics-focused elections, what's very interesting to note is the way in which President Obama's job approval is very linked to how people feel about his job in handling foreign policy. So in addition to asking the question, do you approve or disapprove of the job the president is doing overall, many pollsters will also ask a more specific question. Do you approve or disapprove of the job the president is doing in terms of handling the economy, in terms of handling healthcare? And traditionally, over the last sort of 4 or 5 years of Obama's presidency, his job approval on things like the economy and on healthcare have actually been lower than his job approval overall. You have a certain segment of voters who will say, I'm not crazy about the way that he's handling the economy. I don't necessarily like the way he's handling healthcare, but I still like him and overall think he's at least trying. But in the last year or so, the polling numbers on how he is performing in terms of foreign policy have gotten pretty significantly worse. And that has corresponded then with this erosion of his overall job approval. If not only are folks sort of they feel he's doing a mediocre job on the economy, they think he's doing okay on healthcare, but they're not sure that they can count on him to protect us and keep us safe or keep America's place in the world a strong one, then that leads to them being less enthusiastic about him overall, and again sort of relates to these midterm elections. So even though President Obama's name is not on the ballot, his presence is being felt very strongly up and down the ballot. And just about, I believe, a week ago, when the president was giving a speech, he made a comment where he said, even though my name's not on the ballot, my policies are on the ballot. And many Republicans took that as a quote that was very helpful for them, because there are a number of elections that are happening in states where President Obama did not win that state in the presidential election, and that sort of lends itself to that Democrat perhaps being weaker in this election. So all of that is to say the background for Republicans is still not great. On this question of do you have a favorable or unfavorable view of the Republican Party, Republicans are still viewed favorably by less than 3 out of 10 voters in the United States, which is not a great place to be. And they're sort of only helped by the fact that voters nowadays are not very favorable to the Democratic Party either. It's only 41% of voters have a favorable view of the Democratic Party. About 1 year ago in Congress, there was a government shutdown, and it was sort of viewed as potentially having the effect of making it very difficult for Republicans to do well in these coming midterm elections, because it took any sort of favorability that Republicans had been trying to gain after the 2012 elections and sort of threw it out the window, where voters began to no longer trust any trust that they had tried to gain since the re-election of the president they had lost after the government shutdown. What was beneficial to Republicans was shortly thereafter, the implementation of the president's health care law came into effect and was sort of had a disastrous rollout, where the website that people were supposed to log into to sign up for new healthcare plans did not work. People found that they couldn't keep their old plans. And all of this sort of led to then both parties being viewed as sort of negative, not competent, and not one that voters are particularly excited about. The other thing that's very different about the overall environment for these midterms is that in 2008, 2010, and 2012, the clear number one issue was jobs and the economy. Heading into the presidential election, you had been looking at month after month after month of double-digit unemployment, and voters were just extremely frustrated and wanted to know which side was going to do the best job of getting the economy back on track. The good news is that the economy in the U.S. nowadays is doing somewhat better. There are still long-term structural problems where you have large segments of the population that have been unemployed for a very long time and are simply leaving the workforce. They're no longer even attempting to find work. So you are still finding that there are economic troubles, but overall the unemployment rate is not the same as it was 2 or 4 years ago. And at the same time, foreign affairs have risen as a more critical issue, looking at what's going on with Russia and Ukraine, looking at what's going on with ISIL, looking at what's going on with Syria. Foreign affairs are sort of reasserting themselves in the national discourse. And as a result, I have heard it said that 2014 is an election about nothing in the US, that there is no real national agenda being proposed by either side. The Democrats, in many cases, are trying to either run away from the president's policies or simply not bring them up that much, and Republicans don't really have much that they are running on besides, we don't like the president's policies. And so in that environment, it's sort of less clear what issues are driving voter attitudes. And you have instances, for instance, in the Colorado Senate race, where many of the ads are not about the economy, they're not about jobs, they're not about foreign policy, they're not about America's role in the world. They're about the issue of access to birth control and contraception, that is the issue that the election has devolved into. And depending on which state you're looking at, that issue that much of the advertising around will be very different. So all of which is to say this election is one where the president's poor job approval is making it hard for Democrats to do very well, but Republicans, I believe, are sort of leaving opportunities on the table precisely because their brand is not very good, and they're not exactly running on any kind of positive agenda to demonstrate why they ought to be given control of the Congress, of both halves of the Congress. So now I will walk through the sort of 3 different buckets that we will be looking at in these midterms. As Sally wisely mentioned earlier today, many of the most exciting developments in politics are actually happening at the state legislative level. But for today, I'll focus on elections for U.S. Congress, the U.S. Senate, and some of the gubernatorial races as well. So first, let's turn to the House. The House is perhaps one of the least exciting elements of this election because it is viewed as being highly stable. Republicans have 233 seats in the House. Democrats have 199 at the moment. And very few of these seats are competitive. This is a chart that comes from the Cook Political Report. Charlie Cook and his team are viewed in the U.S. as being among the best sort of election predictors. And they assess how likely each seat in the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate is to changing hands after the election. And out of over 400 seats in the U.S. House of Representatives, these are the only ones that they believe have any real likelihood of changing hands in this election. True toss-up seats, at the time that I grabbed this chart, it was only 17 seats. And even when you're adding in the ones that are lean Democratic and lean Republican, you're really still only looking at 2 to 3 dozen seats that might be in play. So as a result of that, the most recent polling on this question we call the generic congressional ballot. It's a question where you can ask at a national level, when you go to vote this November, who do you think you're most likely to vote for, the Republican candidate for Congress or the Democratic candidate for Congress? Republicans, somewhat surprisingly, have emerged with a very slight lead on this question, despite the fact that fewer than 3 out of 10 American voters have a favorable view of the Republican Party. Like for likely voters this time around, 49% of them say they are likely to vote for a Republican candidate for Congress. This has just led to very little likely movement. If you look back at actually the 2 previous midterm elections, Congress was very much so in flux. In 2006, that was a midterm election that made Nancy Pelosi the Speaker of the House and knocked Republicans out of power in Congress. And then 4 years later, the 2010 midterm elections were the ones that took Nancy Pelosi out of the speakership and put John Boehner into the speakership. So it is somewhat notable that in this election, it's unlikely that very many seats in the U.S. House of Representatives will change hands. Up next are the governor's races, and sort of with D.C. so gridlocked and with very little policy coming out of Washington, D.C., as Sally mentioned, the states are really playing a big role in defining the GOP. If you take a look at the chart that she had put up of all of the different faces of folks who might run for president in 2016, a number of them were governors. And a large part of what they would be likely to run on would be the notion that they are not from Washington, they are not a part of the gridlock, they were not part of the government shutdown, that they in their states are implementing center-right policies that are creating jobs and doing good things. So there are a handful of governor's races that could switch from one party to the other. Alaska, Arizona, Florida, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Kansas are all races that have varying degrees of potential risk. In Michigan, Governor Rick Snyder, he's not necessarily viewed as very vulnerable, but certainly is facing a challenger and might not be reelected. On the other hand, in Florida, which is my home state as well as the state that Sally hails from, the incumbent governor, Rick Scott, is in a very close race with an opponent who actually used to be a Republican 4 years ago and changed parties and now says that he is a Democrat. So that's a race to watch very closely. And then it's not just a matter of seats flipping from Republican to Democrat, but there are a few places where Democrats currently hold the governor's mansion that could ultimately become Republican on Election Day. But let's finally turn to the main event, the U.S. Senate. It is where Republicans need to pick up a net of 6 seats in order to take control of that chamber of Congress. Right now, Republicans have 45 seats, Democrats have 53, and there are 2 independents that caucus with them, so are effectively like Democrats. And what's important to bear in mind here is that the senators who are up for re-election this year were last on the ballot 6 years ago. And what was 6 years ago? It was the first election where Barack Obama was elected president. So you had 2 things going on there that made the electorate sort of unseasonably favorable to Republicans. One was that it was a presidential year, again, where some of these less frequent voters, the reflex voters, will turn out to vote, which helps Democrats. But also, this was an historic election. The president won by an enormous margin. And that's why you had in states like North Carolina, you have states like Arkansas, where even if President Obama did win North Carolina in 2008, but you have a lot of folks who, the last time they were up for re-election, it was a very easy environment for them to run in as a Democrat, and they are now facing very serious headwinds 6 years later. So doing the math, how do Republicans get to that net 6 seats to change the Senate into Republican hands? Well, there are 2 Senate seats that are extremely likely at this point to go from Democratic to Republican, in West Virginia and Montana. These are seats that are very likely to change hands, and there is not a great deal of controversy around them. But that only gets us 2. Republicans need 4 more, and possible opportunities range from South Dakota, Louisiana, Arkansas, North Carolina, Iowa, Colorado, Alaska, New Hampshire. There's a long list of potential seats where Republicans are looking at a possibility of either knocking out a Democratic incumbent or picking up a seat that is considered an open seat, where the Democrat who had been sitting in the seat has chosen not to run for re-election. Now, some of these seem extremely likely to change hands. South Dakota, up until very recently, was considered very likely to change. But that race is very complicated because you have an independent candidate now who is making it less certain how the election will turn out. In a state like Louisiana, Arkansas, and North Carolina, all three of those involve Democratic incumbents who are running in states that Mitt Romney won in the 2012 presidential race. So they are facing the challenge of running in a midterm election in a state that did not favor the president 2 years ago. And so the thing that they have going for them is that being an incumbent is very powerful in American politics. It lets you raise a lot of money, it lets you have a lot of name identification. Unseating an incumbent is a very hard thing to do, and so they have that as sort of a positive in their corner. In a state like Iowa, you have a very interesting race where there's a woman named Joni Ernst who's running, and Iowa is a fascinating state because when we talk about primaries, particularly when we talk about the Republican primary for president, Iowa is the first place where Republican primary voters will express their opinion on who they want the nominee to be for the presidential election. And we often talk about Iowa thinking about it as this very conservative place. But actually, Iowa is a state that voted for President Obama. Iowa is technically a blue state nowadays. So for Republicans to be able to pick up a seat in Iowa would be very important looking ahead toward 2016. There are also some Republicans, however, that are in danger. So when I say that Republicans need to pick up a net of 6 seats, that means that they either need to pick up 6 and not lose any, or if they lose some, they then need to pick up more to make up for it. And the 3 in which these Republicans' seats are potentially vulnerable are Kentucky, Georgia, and Kansas. Now, what's a little bit scary about this is Republicans ought to be doing very well in Kentucky, in Georgia, and in Kansas. These are all Mitt Romney states. These are all red states. But in Kentucky, you have Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, who is in a tough race against a young woman named Allison Lundergan Grimes. In Georgia, you have a match between a Democrat who is, as Sasha mentioned, trying to sort of remake the Georgia electorate so that she has a fighting chance. And then in Kansas, you have a very odd situation where the Democratic candidate was actually very weak and in fact tried to take his own name off of the ballot, but the independent candidate is very strong. And so in Kansas, you have a Senator Pat Roberts who has been in the U.S. Senate for many, many, many years, who is, quite frankly, not used to having to run in a very difficult re-election race, and is now, that seat is potentially in peril for Republicans. So again, for each of these that they lose, they then must win one more off of that previous list. So one of the things that you may see if you are really into following American politics is this whole world of taking polling data and building models about how likely it is that Republicans will or will not take control of the U.S. Senate. To give a sort of very, very brief description of how these work, they take a variety of different polls as their inputs. Say they'll take a poll that shows the Republican is up by 3% in Kentucky. And then maybe there's another poll that shows he's down by 2%. And then maybe there's another poll that shows he and his opponent are neck and neck even. What a model will do, what many of these models that you'll see from things like the New York Times Upshot blog, the Washington Post Monkey Cage blog, 538, is they all take these polls and run simulations to figure out, okay, if this poll is correct, then this is how this state will break. And if that poll in that state is correct, then that is how that state will break. And taking it all together and running about tens of thousands of simulations. In how many instances do Republicans win enough seats that control of the Senate is flipping? And there's actually not a great deal of consensus on this subject. You have certain models, for instance, at Princeton University, some academics believe that at this point, Republicans only have a 51% chance of picking up the U.S. Senate. Meanwhile, at the Washington Post, the academics they have there believe Republicans have a 95% chance of picking up the Senate. The way that each of these models differs, one is in the sort of inputs that it takes. So it's not all of them are just looking at polls. Some of them are looking at things that we call fundamentals, things like the unemployment rate, things like president's job approval. And they're factoring all of that together to try to project out on election day of all the potential scenarios, of all the seats Republicans could win or lose, how likely are they to take the Senate? And as of right now, sort of looking at an average of the models, The average chance of a GOP takeover calculated by Vox.com was 65% toward the end of last week. Which sort of leads to this big final question. What would Republicans do with a Senate majority? Right now, with Congress divided, very little legislation can get through because even if the Senate is controlled by Democrats, whatever they pass cannot get through a Republican House. Whatever the Republican House passes is very rarely able to get through a Democratic Senate, so nothing happens. So if Republicans suddenly get a majority in the U.S. Senate, what then would change? What new policies would Republicans try to pass and then send to the president's desk? And that's entirely unclear at this point. And the expectation is very little would change. That even if Republicans take the control of the U.S. Senate, because of the way the Senate works, you need 6 out of 10 members to agree to bring pieces of legislation to the floor. So even picking up a majority still means you would have that gridlock. The one area where it would have an effect is if you control the Senate, even with just that majority, you get control of the different committees, and you'd also have the ability to heavily influence things like judicial nominees. So Republicans are very eager to take control of the Senate, but the mere difference between having 49 seats and 50 seats, when it comes to the actual policies that Republicans will be being put forward and that the president will or will not be signing into law, it is unclear at this point how much will actually change. So now what does this all mean then for 2016? Well, the demographics of these midterm elections, again, are very different from presidential years. President Obama in 2008 and then again in 2012 was able to create an electorate that had a very significant number of young voters, of voters from minority, racial and ethnic minority communities, that those voters are somewhat less likely to turn out in midterm elections. In 2012, young voters were 19% of all voters, according to the exit polls. In a midterm election, you expect that number to drop down to somewhere between 11 to 12%, so somewhat lower. And these young voters, again, lean more Democratic. So what this means is that Republicans need to be able to win these swing states in a midterm context if they want to have any hope of trying to win them in those more difficult presidential years when the electorate is more tilted against them. And to kind of recap some of what Sally had mentioned before about the difficulties, the demographic headwinds facing Republicans, this is a chart that shows how Democrats have performed with voters from racial and ethnic minority groups in the U.S. going back to 1992. That in fact in 1992, the green line is Asian American voters. Republicans used to win Asian American voters. In fact, in the 1992 presidential election, won them by 24 points. But nowadays, fast forward to the present, and Asian American voters are voting just as heavily Democratic as Hispanic voters. Meanwhile, African American voters, long a very strong voting bloc for the Democratic Party, has become an even stronger voting bloc for the Democratic Party, with 87% of African American voters voting for President Obama in 2012. So in addition to Democrats dramatically increasing their performance with racial and ethnic minority voters, those groups are also dramatically growing as a proportion of the electorate. Asian American voters now make up about 3% of all voters. Hispanic voters, 10% and only growing. There are a number of states in the United States, for instance, New Mexico, where a majority of children born today are Latino. In 18 years, they'll be growing up and they'll be voting. And it's very important for Republicans over the long term to be performing better among these groups if they want to have a shot at winning. And you also can't separate out the troubles that Republicans are having with young voters with the troubles they are having with minority voters. For voters who are over the age of 30, 76% of them were white in the last presidential election. But for voters under the age of 30, it was less than 6 out of 10. Where we're seeing a lot of this demographic shift is really also reflective of how young voters are behaving. And with these two forces combined, it really spells a significant long-term challenge for the GOP. For someone who turns 18 years old on the day before the election in 2016, whether they're choosing between Hillary Clinton or another Democratic nominee and among a large collection of Republican potential nominees, someone who casts their very first vote in the 2016 presidential election based on average life expectancy can be expected to continue voting until the presidential election of 2076. So there are very long-term implications to winning these younger voters, to winning these voters from racial and ethnic minority groups, early on so that as they begin that habit of voting and as they develop those party loyalties that we talked about earlier today, they are not voters that are lost forever to the GOP. Because what we're seeing in terms of young voters in the US and this sort of intersection of minority voters and young voters is really creating a historic moment in terms of the generation gap. Republicans have won young voters before. A myth that I often find myself pushing back against is a quote that is sometimes, I think, misattributed to Winston Churchill, which says, "If you are young and conservative, you have no heart. If you are old and liberal, you have no brain." This quote is then used to try to justify why it's perfectly okay for young people or for Republicans to not be winning young people because, well, magically, one day they'll get married and they'll buy a home and they'll start paying taxes and they will somehow become more conservative through that process. It's actually not necessarily the case. That sort of brand loyalty to a political party is very hard to dislodge, and particularly nowadays when this younger millennial generation is less likely to be buying a home, is less likely to be buying a car, is less likely to be getting married. With all of those factors, that even further mitigates this idea that young people will just magically one day grow up and become conservatives. So again, Republicans have won young voters before. Richard Nixon actually won 52% of the youth vote, the very first year that 18-year-olds were allowed to vote in the United States. Ronald Reagan won young voters by 19 points in his re-election in 1984. And you notice that even as recently as 2004, George W. Bush won 45% of young voters in his re-election. It really wasn't until 2008 that this dramatic generation gulf erupted and does not show significant signs of closing back to the norm anytime soon. So can Republicans hold, for instance, the governor's mansion in Florida and Michigan? Can they pick up a Senate seat in Colorado and Iowa? The results of 2014 are going to set the scene for how Republicans can put together enough states to take the White House back in 2016. Because that is the big question. Which states can Republicans win that Mitt Romney lost? And if Republicans are having difficulty winning in these states during a midterm year, it does not look very good for their chances to win them in a normal presidential year. So I would suggest to all of you as you are watching American politics over the next couple of weeks, really pay attention to many of those states that were considered swing states and battleground states in 2012, and look at how they break at a statewide level in this election. And that will give clues about whether or not Republicans in favorable circumstances will have what it takes to put together a coalition to take back the White House in 2016. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the presentation, and I think that's what I also like about American politics. It's the politics of the states you need to win, the people you put in there, and it becomes very interesting. But let me just start with one question, which sort of you implied when you asked what actually happens when the Republicans win the Senate or dominate the Congress. Could there be a scenario where a potential presidential candidate on the Republican side says actually maybe you shouldn't take the Senate now because then it might just like lead to a point where people get remembered of the gridlock, they get even more fed up with politics in Washington and how maybe the Republicans behave, instead of like now it's all the Democrats. So what are your thoughts on that?
So I certainly hope as a Republican that Republicans pick up as many seats as possible, if only because being elected to the US Senate, you're elected for 6 years. That's longer than the term you're elected for president. That math adds up over time. And so having more Republicans in the Senate now, sort of banking those votes when we can get them, I think is very important. But there are sort of two elements to what you talk about. One is what I've called a false positive. I've heard some folks call it a false dawn. That if Republicans do very well in these elections, that they will assume that all is well. Look, Republicans are going to pick up seats in the Senate. Great. Then everything that was coming out of Sally's report and everything that folks have been talking about, we must have already done it because we're doing great. In 2010, I think that's essentially what happened to Republicans. We got crushed in the 2008 election, and then you had this kind of Tea Party energy and voter frustration, and magically in 2010, the tables seem to have turned again. Republicans are back doing very well. They've taken Congress. And it allowed people to think that sort of all was well. It allowed them to overlook the long-term challenges facing Republicans. And so they didn't do the hard work they needed to do to become viable over the long term. Instead, it sort of took away the sense of urgency. And so I hope that if Republicans, so I've heard some say, I hope Republicans don't do well in 2014 because they don't deserve it. They haven't done the things they need to do long term, so I'd hate for them to get another false positive. The other element is when we talk about an agenda and what you would put forward, I think one of the reasons why you haven't seen very many Republicans running on any kind of an agenda is they are worried about what you described, that putting a target on their back. If they run on any kind of an agenda that Democrats can demonize or misconstrue, it potentially puts at risk this modest Republican advantage. Whereas if Republicans just kind of play it safe, attack the president, he's not very popular anyways, it is the safer strategy. But I do think ultimately we are leaving a couple seats on the table because we've not done what we need to repair that Republican brand and persuade that, small but still important sliver of voters who I think could be persuaded to vote Republican.
I want to open for questions. Are there any questions so far? I got another one. So again, just like we were saying at the end, that there has not been really an issue out there. Is it just because both sides are not really interested to talk about the economy or to talk about healthcare, or is it just like Obama has become the embodiment of a bad economy, a bad healthcare plan? Or why is it that none of these sides has an interest of actually putting up an agenda?
Well, I think that, so let's take a look at what happened in the 2012 election. So in the 2012 election, the economy was far and away the #1 issue. And even in that context, you couldn't really get these national candidates to focus on the economy. I have long believed that the Romney campaign made a huge strategic error in assuming that they could run on this question of, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Which is sort of, it's a cliche in American politics that, well, if things aren't going well, ask someone, were you better off than you were 4 years ago? And if they say no to that question, then magically they'll vote for the other party. The problem was a lot of Americans were doing slightly better than they were 4 years ago, because 4 years earlier, the economy was in shambles. Major banks were closing. People were losing their homes. And so instead of running on why Mitt Romney would be the candidate who would make the economy better in 2016 compared to an Obama presidency, they instead ran on sort of litigating how bad the current economy was and who was at fault. And because many voters still thought that George W. Bush was primarily at fault, that wasn't a dynamic that helped Republicans. So by not really running on a clear agenda of here's what Mitt Romney would do to make the economy better, it just was not a dynamic where Republicans could fully capitalize. So I think what you're seeing now is it's not even that the economy is the #1 issue. If you look at the polls, used to be that 40% of people would say the economy is my top issue. And nowadays it's fallen. I've seen polls where it's been in the high 20s, the low 30s, but you're seeing foreign affairs rise up. And a lot of these folks who are running for Senate, they don't really want to come out in a strong way on one side or another of a debate about what to do about Syria, because who knows what's going to happen tomorrow in Syria, and you might be on the wrong side of that conversation. So they don't want to talk too much about foreign policy. In many of these cases, the politics of the Obamacare law are kind of in question because it's viewed as being an unpopular law, but there are pieces of it that are very popular. So, for instance, I mentioned previously that in Colorado, there's a big debate around availability of birth control and contraception. That's a debate related to the Obamacare law. So one can come out and say, I dislike Obamacare, but then be at risk of being attacked. Well, do you not want people to be covered? Do you not want people to have health care? Do you not want women to have access to contraception? And so the politics are sort of tricky on both sides. And I think as a result of that, and because neither party says, here's the big policy vision we have for America, these elections are becoming about kind of small ball type issues.
There's a question right there, please.
As an analyst, you're dealing with hypotheticals. What kind of structural changes, substantive changes in the US political dynamics do you see in the future? 5 years, 10 years?
So I think that a major dynamic, again, will be shaped by the demographic and cultural change that I talked about earlier. So really having a change in how we as a nation talk about things like immigration, I think is inevitable and is going to occur. I think if you want to talk also about the structure of American politics, another thing that is a hotly debated issue, but you rarely see actual change on it, so I'm uncertain how much prospect there is for real change here, but is on the question of campaign finance. So in recent elections now, very wealthy individuals, corporations, can make very large, unlimited contributions, not to candidates themselves, but to these outside groups that sort of advocate on behalf of a candidate. And for a variety of legal reasons, they can't officially coordinate. And what that has led to, I think that is significantly related to the increase in very highly negative advertising that we see. Politics has always been negative. Folks will sometimes complain, oh, politics is so nasty these days. Politics has been nasty, at least in the United States, pretty much since the beginning. The difference now is that, so for instance, the firm that I worked for back in 2012 was working for one of the presidential candidates on the Republican side, who was ultimately unsuccessful in the primary, and his campaign did not have very much money. But there was a super PAC on the outside that had seemingly unlimited dollars to spend. We were not allowed to coordinate messaging with them, but that outside group could therefore define what our candidate was all about, could define what the opponents were that they were going to attack. And I think there's a lot of concern now about has political voice been taken away from the people whose names are actually on the ballot and sort of gone to these outside groups. Now, we have, freedom of speech sort of is the First Amendment in our Constitution, so protecting that is incredibly important. And finding that right balance between protecting freedom of speech and ensuring a healthy political process is one of the debates we are having. The only reason I would suggest there may not be actual tangible change on this front is that campaign finance reform winds up being an issue that only 2 to 3% of voters say is their number one issue. So in the grand scheme of things, economy, healthcare, foreign policy, campaign finance reform, and changing how we run our elections ranks very low. So it's unlikely that we will actually see, Congress pass any bills that change how we think about these laws. But I think watching as these outside groups and all of this significant amount of money, watching that evolve is something that I think will have a big effect on the next 10 years of American politics.
There's another question up there, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. The first question is on gerrymandering. You have not mentioned how that affects elections and how that gives Republicans an advantage from the onset. And then the second question is the turnout models, like for 2008 and 2012. I think the Republicans were off with the turnout models. How likely do you think that the Republicans are off even with these midterms?
I'm sorry, do
the
you
final
mind?
question.
Oh, okay.
I think he's referring to turnout models.
Okay.
You have these moderate Republicans, and your electorate is becoming less and less white. And you have moderate Republicans who are actually saying that the Republican Party is becoming obsolete. What is your thoughts on this? And finally, about the Daily Beast, I think you supported Barack Obama twice, right?
So not me personally. The way a site like that works is a variety of contributors can choose different.
The founder of the Daily Beast supported Barack Obama twice. Is the Daily Beast becoming more progressive?
So I won't comment on the Daily Beast. I apologize, but as an individual columnist, I'm responsible for the content of my own columns, but I don't want to speak on behalf of a sort of broad, wide-ranging news site. To tackle your first question about gerrymandering, so in that chart that I showed that showed only 2 to 3 dozen seats in the U.S. House of Representatives are actually competitive, that's a lot of what's going on there. That you have these districts that are sort of crafted where very smart map makers have chosen voters instead of voters choosing their elected officials. So the number of places in the U.S. where there are truly swing districts is minimized. But it's not just about gerrymandering, it's also about the fact that we are now seeing people begin to kind of move into communities with people more like them. So people who are very Republican are tending to live in the same kinds of neighborhoods and the same kinds of places. People who tend to be Democratic are tending to move to the same kinds of neighborhoods and the same kinds of places. They have various cultural and consumer preferences that are leading that to occur. But so it's not just gerrymandering, although that is certainly a part of it, that is leading to sort of a lack of swing areas or a lack of, some folks will sort of bemoan a lack of moderates in Congress. Everybody's on the extremes because they've all been elected in these very sort of single-minded districts. The thing to keep in mind that I always like to point out when people blame gerrymandering for polarization is that the states are not gerrymandered, and yet the US Senate is still highly polarized these days. And it's not because the shapes of the states were carved in a different way. But one, it's somewhat a factor, again, of a little bit of this sorting where people are moving to, they live in states where other people like them behave like them. But it's a matter of this sort of ideological alignment with the parties, where maybe 20 years ago, you could be conservative and be a Democrat, or you could be liberal and be Republican, and that was more okay. And now the ideological positions, as well as the party brands, have become more in sync. So you're seeing fewer and fewer of the liberal Republicans and fewer of the conservative Democrats who are out there. And then sort of last, I'll try to tackle the remaining two questions together. So I think the way that a lot of Republicans have been trying to figure out who was going to vote, Republicans, I think, are running into a lot of trouble with this because their old assumptions have not yet caught up to the new realities that are being shaped by A, demographics, but B, the sorts of things that Sasha was talking about with Democrats mobilizing huge groups of new voters. We recently had a troubling sort of small-scale example where the majority leader in the U.S. House of Representatives lost a primary in his own district. And again, this is a primary. This isn't about Obama mobilizing new voters or anything. This is just, he was used to running with one type of electorate, and his researchers and strategists didn't realize how that had changed, and didn't realize that there was a possibility that he wouldn't win his primary. And it turned out not only did he not win his primary, he lost by a double-digit margin and has already resigned from Congress. So I think a challenge for Republicans is they have very established ways of figuring out who they think are or are not likely to vote. And these are all relatively reliable variables. Did you vote in the last election? Things like that. They're still highly predictive. But I think Republicans need to get somewhat better about doing things like figuring out early voting on their side and looking at that and who is turning in more ballots. I've seen a lot of discussion about early voting in North Carolina and in Iowa, where Republicans are apparently attempting to make an effort this cycle to do a little better about getting those early voters to try to mitigate any effects from the other side. But I think Republicans need to get better about realizing that the old way that you would predict who was going to turn out to vote is disrupted by the fact that Democrats are now getting so good about creating new voters.
Okay, let me just, there's one last question and I have the very last. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you for your talk. I have a question about young voters. So with the significant percentage of young people voting Democratic, what do you think the Republican Party can do to repair the Republican brand for young people and to actually make it attractive again for them to vote it?
So I think it really all boils down to one sentence that I heard one time in a focus group. I was traveling around the US, sitting down with groups of young voters and just talking to them about politics, and the one refrain that I kept hearing over and over was sort of encapsulated in the sentence. I wish they understood what I was going through. That there was a sense that Democrats got how young voters' lives are different nowadays, that they got how the economy is different, how they're building families in different ways, how their cultural preferences have changed, while Republicans didn't really get it, that Republicans were still kind of assuming that everyone wanted to pursue this very traditional lifestyle, and so there was a sense Republicans don't have any policies that would make my life better. They don't have any ideas that are applicable to me. And so I think for Republicans to begin doing well among young voters, one, they have to make them a priority. Democrats clearly make them a priority, and Republicans have long either taken them for granted, if not sort of been outright hostile to more young voters voting. So one, the first step is admitting you have the problem, admitting that Republicans even need to make young people a priority. But two, it's about figuring out how center-right principles and the things that Republicans should stand for can actually lead to young people having better lives and better futures. And there's a huge disconnect there where when you ask young people what do they think the Republican Party stands for, they think of things like tax cuts for wealthy people, very restrictive immigration policies, and sort of positions on things like the definition of marriage that are at odds culturally with where young people are. So I think figuring out how we make it, even if it's not that the party wakes up tomorrow and changes its position on all of these things, but at least create space for disagreement and debate within the party over these issues, I think is extremely, extremely important. And I think those two things, making young voters a priority and creating space for healthy debate within the party over some of these controversial issues, is the first step that Republicans need to take to trying to win back young people.
Thank you very much. We cannot end this session without getting like a top 3 of the potential presidential candidates in 2016. I didn't dare to ask Sally earlier, but can you, I mean, we have Hillary on the Democratic side, but who's it going to be like? Is there a number 2 or number 3 potential on the Democratic side? And who are the first 3 to watch on the Republican side?
So on the I'll take the Democratic side first. Just recently you mentioned that I'm up at Harvard for the semester, and we had a visit from our nation's Vice President Biden, who gave a speech that was somewhat controversial in the end, because he made a few statements about some of our allies in the Middle East that were viewed as, if not untrue, at least things he should not have been saying publicly. Classic Biden, right? I suspect could run, and I don't know how strong of a challenger he would be, but I think what he does do is he is very good at capturing this kind of sort of blue-collar, Midwest, Northeast kind of, he's Scranton Joe, from the mountains in Pennsylvania, kind of mentality where I don't know to what extent Hillary Clinton is really, really connected to that piece of the Democratic Party. And so, we'll see. And then there's also this question of, will somebody challenge Hillary from the left? Somebody like an Elizabeth Warren, or even if not Elizabeth Warren herself. I believe it was just a day or 2 ago that Elizabeth Warren gave a speech where she said something like, Obama has been protecting Wall Street, and that somebody will run on that kind of a platform of, even the modern Democratic Party is too comfortable with big business. Hillary Clinton is too comfortable with Wall Street and big corporations. She represented them for a long time when she was senator from New York. We can't trust her. You need somebody who's a real Democrat. So that could happen on the Democratic side. On the Republican side, it is insanely and completely wide open. And so I would be foolish to sort of put my money down on one or two names here, especially since you're recording it. This could come back. You could re-show this when these candidates inevitably sort of implode later on.
I'm not asking for putting money on it.
I can tell
just
you who I
just name
like,
the field. You have 10. You have 10.
So I do think, as somebody who I grew up in Florida, the very first vote I ever cast was for Governor Jeb Bush's re-election as governor of the state of Florida. So I'm quite fond of him, and I think what's incredible about him is he's quite conservative. He's conservative in principle, but sort of moderate in temperament. And I think that's something that Republicans will need to find. Someone who is principled, who does have ideas, who does have solutions. They're not just sort of running to the middle for the sake of political expediency. They're somebody that's really rooted in ideas of some sort. But they are not engaging in the sort of fiery and angry rhetoric that can be off-putting to voters who do not share those views. So I think Jeb Bush is a great example of someone who can do that. But whether it's, we've got a number of interesting governors, we've got Chris Christie, we've got Scott Walker, all of whom will point to the things that they did in their states, whether that's pension reform, whether that's, in the case of Governor Christie, trying to reach across the aisle and win over Democratic voters, they'll point to the things they did in their states as examples of why they should be chosen. Then in terms of senators, you'll have folks like Rand Paul or folks like Marco Rubio who are likely to run on a platform of, here's what I did in Washington to try to stand up to President Obama and to advance conservative principles. So it remains to be seen which of those strategies will yield the best success. But sort of in closing on that topic, We talk a lot about how you have to move so far to the right in the GOP to win a primary, and then you have to move back to the middle to win the general. And I think what that misses is if you actually look at the exit polls from, say, the 2012 presidential primary in a state like South Carolina. South Carolina is a very red state. It is possibly the most conservative of the red states. In that election, if you looked at the exit polls, they asked people who voted that day, do you consider yourself very conservative, somewhat conservative, moderate, or liberal? And very conservatives made up about a third, and then you had moderates and liberals who made up about a third, and you had somewhat conservatives who made up about a third. So for folks, the conversation always turns into how are folks going to fight over that 1/3 that says they're very conservative, forgetting that about 2/3 of people who turn out in a Republican primary in South Carolina don't necessarily consider themselves very conservative. So I think whoever can put together a coalition that includes that somewhat conservative, and then some folks from the very or some folks from the moderate section, I think is going to have the most success. But running to only win one of those three sections, whether you, in my opinion, like John Huntsman did in 2012, sort of only ran to win that moderate segment and did not succeed, and you had a lot of them who all only ran for that very conservative segment and did not succeed. Running for that somewhat conservative group, I think, seems to be a real possible key to success.
Okay, so thank you very much for the names in the top 5. It was very interesting to talk about American politics again, and I think most people share that impression. So thank you very much, Kristen. And now, yeah, thank you.